lucky to be launching this report and have a number of speakers, as well as Simon Thompson, Chairman of Tullow Oil, who will also add some remarks. So this event, as you know, because I can see a number of you have copies, I don't have one, but Simon has it here. I think we've already run out of copies, maybe, but I think it's on the internet. There's more coming, good. I mean, this meeting is all about the launch of this report by the Kenyan Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas, entitled Setting the Agenda for Development of Kenya's Oil and Gas Resources. So if you don't have a copy, we'll try and make sure that there are more available on the table on the left. The context is, in 2012, Kenya joined the swathe of East African countries with recent significant oil and gas discoveries. It's something myself I've watched with keen interest. Before coming down here with the speakers, I was discussing that 5 or 6 years ago, I used to attend oil and gas conferences, and Kenya was the graveyard slot. There would be myself and a couple of die-hard journalists, and nobody else would be interested at all. That you're all in the room suggests that has dramatically changed. Now this is a frontier area of great interest, and it's very heartening to see a quality report like the one that the Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas from Kenya has produced. I think this also shows the learning and the development of debate, discussion and research on what should be the agenda of managing natural resource endowments, including oil and gas. So just a couple of other points, that this is on the record. You might be at Chatham House, but you don't need to remember anything about the Chatham House rule. It's fully on the record, which means you can report everything that's being said. We're also being very democratic and inclusive today, so it's not just you, the lucky ones in this room, but we are live streaming this. So anybody that is watching through live stream, you can use Twitter with the hashtag Chatham House, CH Africa, to ask some questions if you want to when we come to Q&A. So those are kind of the housekeeping issues. I just would like to then introduce our first speakers. We have 2 speakers to present the findings of the report. They're going to talk each for about 7.5 minutes, so they're very disciplined they are, it sounds. We've got John Ocholo, who is the coordinator of Eco News and chair of the Kenya Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas. He has over 13 years' experience in economic justice and development issues and is leading the ENI, so that's Eco News Africa's work in the extractive sector. John is also part of the Africa Trade Network, ATN. And then we also have Charles Wanguru. He's the coordinator of the Kenya Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas. He previously headed the programs department of the Africa Centre for Open Governance, which is a think tank which has a focus on structural causes of corruption. He has also worked with the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights and also spent a period at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, DIHR, in Copenhagen. Actually, I was hearing about him because I flew in from Copenhagen this morning and was talking to people from the Danish Institute yesterday. So they said, we were very lucky to have you here in London at Chatham House speaking. So I forget, which of you is starting in the 7.5? John, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much for all of you who are here today. It's a real pleasure for us from the Kenya Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas to be here today. I'll make brief commentary and brief opening remarks, and then Charles, my colleague, will take over to give us the most substantive information on what the report holds. But I wanted to start my remarks by just to remind us all that this oil and gas find in Kenya has been done in Turkana, which is an area that has historically been marginalized and neglected. And since independence, no real development has taken place in Turkana. And then in 2012, as Alex has said, oil and gas was found in Turkana. So then this means serious development challenges for us, because we have oil that has been discovered in an area that has been neglected. We in civil society are playing catch up because we've not been involved in oil and gas issues historically. We've been dealing with other issues such as human rights, environment, etc. But no real substantive work on oil and gas and what it means for the development of our country. So one of the challenges then we have is what is the overall development dimension or development matrix as we as Kenya are going to take to ensure that oil remains a blessing and less of this curse that we've been hearing about in other regions. So in 2012, when oil was discovered, we quickly came together as civil society under the auspices of Oxfam, GB in Kenya, and held a civil society meeting that invited as many stakeholders as possible to understand what oil and gas find meant and what would be our structured engagement amongst ourselves with Tallow, with private sector, and with government to ensure that the voices of civil society, and particular the voices of the community, get heard. Because knowing how development takes place and knowing that oil and gas was found in Turkana, we needed a structured engagement with the community at the local level. So from this inception meeting, it was decided that it would be imperative for us in civil society to organize ourselves in such a way that we come together under a platform, because we said if we remain divided, we will not have a clear justification and we will not have a clear message to help ourselves and the community. So it was mooted early in mid-2012 that we should have the platform. And then we worked quite hard to ensure that this platform is up and running. And of course, in about a year later in 2013, we did actually formally launch the Kenya Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas. And it does have, it started off with an interim steering committee, but now it has a fully fledged committee, and we do have the coordinator, Charles, who's now working with the platform. And Charles is helping us coordinate our work. So we are from a variety of civil society groups. We have human rights organizations, we have organizations working on environment, we have organizations working on women's issues, we have organizations working on economic justice, trade, we have organizations on the tax justice campaign, because we felt, again, it has to be as broad spectrum as possible. And so the first point is that we need a collective voice for CSOs to engage. And then we also needed an inclusive and informed dialogue on the development of these resources and what it means for the community. So one of our key partners, which is Friends of Lake Turkana, who have historically worked on environmental issues, is now engaging with us and working very closely with the community in Turkana to ensure then their voices are amplified and their voices are heard. And then we are also been engaging in the policy-making process. So we had a mining act that was developed way back in the 1980s and was out of date, and the government is now reviewing that mining legislation. The government is reviewing environment and petroleum legislation. We've engaged extensively with the government on the Mining Act. We've made inputs through civil society platforms. We've held meetings amongst ourselves. We've held meetings with the government itself to engage in the mining bill, and I think that's something that maybe Danga will speak to later. And to outline, I think the report talks about 5 key areas. So it's petroleum revenue management and distribution, local content issues, transparency and accountability, community and environment, and policy and legislation. And I said Charles will speak to that later. But what are the things that we learned, maybe from civil society campaigns from before, is that we're trying to ensure, like, for example, when we talk about local content, we ensure that it actually benefits our society. But not only that, is to ensure that some of the trade negotiations that we are doing at a country level do not impinge negatively on that. So, for example, the East African community is now currently negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with the United States. If you look at the contents of that treaty, it ensures that local content will not be part of the development of the structure of our economy. We've historically done campaigns around the economic partnership agreements. What does that negotiating mandate that currently is deadlocked between EAC, the East African Community, which are 5 countries, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, entail? Because the European Union has insisted that we must get rid of export taxes. And we in East Africa, we who are poor, and we who are least developed countries, know that export taxes remain the key vehicle or instrument that we can use for the development of our economies and our sectors. So if we give bilateral investment treaties, if we give economic partnership agreements on the one hand away, and then we have this oil bonanza, this new resource that then we can then use to develop our agricultural sector, to our manufacturing sector, to our services industry, to create jobs, for our people, what then will happen? So it's ensuring that civil society has a collective voice under the umbrella of the Kenya Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas, and then a structured developmental dialogue that is inclusive, participatory, and ensures the hopes, rights, and aspirations of particularly those local communities where these resources have been found gets involved. Because development does not happen in a vacuum. Development is structured, and sometimes development is deliberate. And it's for the government to ensure that the development direction that Kenya wants to take in concert with the East African partners takes place. So although the oil resource has been found in Turkana, it is for the country, it is for the region. But natural resource exploitation or usage can become very difficult given the historical context. So please let's remember that this is a part of the country that has been in conflict for a very long time. This is part of a country that I said earlier has been neglected. So if this resource find is not structured well, can that lead to serious conflict? And I should have said earlier that the land in Turkana is held in a communal basis. So Turkana County Council has held that land in trust for the community. So what happens when an oil block is given or concession is given to a particular private company to exploit? Does the community have access to those historical grazing grounds? Can they access the water points? If they can't access the water points, will conflict ensue? And then, finally, I think, again, we have run into the same problem that when we talk about oil, people have immediately thought that the benefits are going to accrue overnight. And historically, this has not happened. So the expectations of development and what these resources can do has been very high. So we're trying to manage those expectations. So I'll stop here and then maybe we'll take questions and comments later. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much. Before I hand to Charles, just a reminder to those who have recently joined us that this is a meeting that is on the record fully. It is not under the Chatham House rule. And if you've joined us through live streaming, you can also ask questions using the Twitter hashtag CHAfrica. Charles.
Yeah. Thanks, John. I'm really honored to be here today to share the findings of our report. And I hope you'll appreciate that with 7.5 minutes, I won't be able to drill in too much to all the details, but I hope you'll get a copy of the report. And if you don't, it will be available on our website, which is kcspog.org. I'll go straight into the first area, which is institutional framework. And our key finding on the institutional framework that exists in Kenya at the moment is that there's a lack of a clear demarcation of roles between the regulatory role, the policy role, and commercial operations. So at the moment, we are finding that the Cabinet Secretary is both responsible for policy making, but as well has regulatory roles in terms of issuing licenses, cancelling those licenses, and for us that's sort of problematic. And similarly, the National Oil Company, which is involved in the commercial side of things, also has a regulatory role where you do find that oil companies are still reporting to the National Oil Company, even though ideally they should be almost competing. And our proposal there is that the National Oil Company should just focus on purely commercial operations, and it should be funded to enable it to actually participate in this role more effectively. And the ministry should focus purely on the policy-making role, and we are proposing that we have a full-time regulator just for the upstream sector in Kenya to sort of handle the regulatory role there. And the second area that John mentioned as well is petroleum revenue management. And in our research, what we found that there's currently no framework for spending of petroleum revenues when they will arrive. And so under this section, what we are proposing is firstly a national plan for handling this development, and which will contain comprehensive clauses or policy on what the spending will be on, what investment will be, and the savings policy as well. And for us, we feel that these should be separate from what is currently happening in Kenya. So therefore, there should be a budget fund, a separate stabilization fund, as well as a sovereign wealth fund, or what other people call now a future generations fund. And for us, what's more critical is having clear rules of transfer of how any withdrawals will be made from those separate and different funds. And lastly, under petroleum revenue management is that Kenya has gone through devolution. So now we have 47 counties. And we are pushing, in line with the Constitution of Kenya, for a revenue sharing model between the national government, the county government, and the communities where the oil has been found. But as well, what we are pushing for is a capacity development for the county governments to prepare for when they receive these revenues, so that we do not see wastage even at the county level, so that you do not have counties receiving this just sort of as a windfall and ends up being in recurrent expenditure and wasteful spending. So I mean, those are our key proposals under petroleum revenue management. John touched on local content. Local content is the other big issue that our report sort of covers. And in our research, we found that there's no framework beyond the production sharing contract. The production sharing contract talks about where possible, the companies will seek local goods and services. So what we are calling for there is for government to develop a more comprehensive standalone legislation on local content, which spells out realistic targets and conditions for achieving this local content, including provisions around segmentation and also sort of preventing fronting and bid rigging. And the other thing for us, and John quickly mentioned, where the area where it is, a lot of the areas where they found, I mean, they're largely marginalized areas. You look at Turkana, the literacy levels, I mean, you're talking about an illiteracy rate of almost 89% and almost over 90% in women. So we feel that in the local content legislation, it's key that they cater for gender components to ensure that women and youth are actively involved in the process. And just as a key indicator, I must mention now that a lot of times when we have protests, and we've had protests in the oil-producing areas where operations have had to be stopped, they've largely been led by the youth and women as well in some instances. So it's important to see how do we include these segments of society specifically in that sector. The other area that we've looked into was land rights. And I don't want to belabor what John has already said, but majority of the finds are in areas where there's no demarcation of land. So there's no sort of single title held by Charles or John to this property. So what happens is that it's communal land. And for us, the current framework is very weak on protection of community interests. Because the county, of course, the county government is holding it in trust. But the bigger law, which is supposed to have been passed, is the Community Land Bill. Now that has been stuck somewhere in a ministry for over the last year. So at the moment, there's no adequate legislation of how the communities can actually either get access or be included in discussions around development of oil. One of our other proposals is that we should establish no exploration zones, and this should be declared, which include small water bodies, grazing lands, and other strategic locations. Because a lot of the areas where we find the finds are, I mean, there's scarcity of water, there's scarcity of pasture. So it's important that the local communities are able to still go about their local livelihoods. As well, we're proposing for technical assistance for county governments to effectively participate in discussions on oil field development and environmental impact assessment processes. At the moment, we are seeing that a lot of the EIAs, it's a box-ticking exercise where the individuals who are involved are not actually able to understand what some of the impacts mean. So when they're involved in the process, even though they are consulted, they're just not able to actually give sufficient input to influence how these processes are actually occurring. Again, under land rights, similar to local content, Kenya is a largely patriarchal society. And what you'll find that even where there's negotiations on compensation for land, women are not involved, and the youth as well are not involved when it comes to discussions around compensation or resettlement. And as well, I'd like to mention there that there's a resettlement and evictions bill which has also sort of gotten stuck somewhere. And I think that's a big challenge that we're also finding, that because we passed a new constitution in 2010, a lot of the laws are still being implemented, as well as we are moving forward with with the extraction of these resources. So you're getting two very parallel processes, which ideally, in an ideal world, the Community Land Bill, for example, would have been implemented way before. The fifth area we've looked at is environment. And from our research, we find that the current legal framework requires amending to cater for the unique nature of the oil and gas exploration. For example, it is lacking, for example, on provisions such as exclusive liability. And also, the other issue is that the regulator, we are finding this odd situation where the regulator is implementing legislation far behind what some of the oil companies are implementing. So you find that the oil companies are way ahead in some of the environmental processes that they are following, and the regulator is sort of stuck in this old law. So we are proposing that the Environmental Management and Coordination Act is sufficiently amended to cater for the unique nature of the oil and gas sector. The last topic that we looked at was transparency and accountability. And here, what is clear is that there's no provisions around contract disclosure. There's no provisions around competitive bidding for the licensing blocks. And as well, there's no mechanism for disclosure of petroleum revenues and expenditure once they arrive. So we are proposing that, consistent with the Kenyan Constitution, which talks about access to information, that this new law should include provisions that ensure disclosure of contracts, revenues, and expenditure. And for us, those three things are linked, that you do have to have contract disclosure as well as revenue disclosure, but as well, the missing link has always been expenditure. So what happens when this money comes in? And there's sufficient examples in Africa of where you've managed to maximize the revenues, but then the expenditure has not resulted in any sort of change in the communities. And the other issue that we've highlighted is a transparent process of licensing. At the moment, we do not have a transparent process of licensing. And what we've called for is sort of a moratorium on the issuance of new licenses until the law is in place to ensure competitive bidding for any new blocks. That's sort of a quick run through of our report, and I'm happy to sort of engage more with questions. But I mean, overall, our recommendations call for the engagement of all actors in the sector, not only civil society, but also government, as well as the international oil companies and county governments, to ensure that Kenya actually benefits from this newly found resources. Thank you.
Charles, thanks very much. So you've had authors presenting the findings of the report. We're now going to move to two discussants to kind of widen the discussion of the contextually and also sectorally. So the first of those is Ndanga Kamu, who is the Oil and Gas Advisor at Oxfam Kenya, and she leads on all policy and advocacy matters relating to the extractive sector. Prior to joining Oxfam in 2014, she was an associate in the international arbitration practice of a leading international law firm based in Houston, Texas, the United States. Ndanga, welcome to Chatham House, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So my role here is to represent Oxfam's engagement in this sector, both as a founding member of the Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas, but also as one of the civil society groups that will be implementing the findings of the report. So there's been some consternation in Kenya and internationally about Oxfam's engagement in the oil and gas sector. And really, it's a simple answer. What Oxfam wants to see is the development of the oil and gas sector in a way that benefits all Kenyans. And our engagement on this is on two levels. One is a national level, which I'll explain in a moment, and the other is an international level, which I'll also run through. So at the national level, we're engaging both on policy and legislation development, mainly in Nairobi, because that's the seat of power, as you know, but also at the county level. Now, it's probably helpful to explain where we are with new legislation and policy in the petroleum sector to understand why it is that this is an area that we've prioritized. So as John and Charles have explained, the sector is very new in Kenya. And any policies on energy and any legislation that we have is not fit for purpose, as it were. So at the moment, we have a technical committee, which is an interministerial team, which is finalizing a petroleum bill, which is going to be presented to Cabinet any minute now. At the same time, it is finalizing an energy policy, which covers the entire energy sector, so from electricity to renewables to petroleum. And the third thing is finalizing a draft PSC. Now, these processes are happening very quickly, and at a time when the reality is that the capacity in national government is not yet at the point where we're able to develop the appropriate policies, as we're still in the process of determining what the needs are, in the process of determining exactly what the size of the resources are, in the process of thinking about the infrastructure, financing the infrastructure, deciding who will own the infrastructure, those kinds of things. So what Oxfam and other civil society groups are trying to do is to review those drafts as they become available and input into the process of finalizing the drafts. Now, we've seen the government being quite open to input from civil society, and we've had opportunities to present our work to both the technical committee and to the Office of the President. In terms of transparency and accountability, which is the focus of today's discussion, we have seen a desire to implement the provision on access to information that's in the Constitution in Article 45. And to that end, we've identified a few mentions of a desire for more accountability, more transparency in both the process of licensing and contract disclosure, which is a key point of our work. Specifically, we've seen in the energy policy, which is the sort of the vision of the development of the sector in the short, medium, and long term, we've seen a commitment to start the process of joining the EITI, which is Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So that's written down and appears to be a motivating factor on transparency issues. With respect to the draft law, we've seen mention, there's a section that specifically deals with the transparency and accountability, and that gives responsibility to the Cabinet Secretary to develop regulations on transparency and accountability. So a lot of what the bill does at the moment, it's quite long compared to what was there before, but is not so long that it's extremely comprehensive on the issues that Charles, for example, has mentioned. And part of the motivation of that is that in order to get it out quickly, it necessarily leaves gaps. And those gaps are to be filled with regulations in the next, after the draft has come into law. And hopefully these processes are happening in tandem, but will be completed after that process when we have more information on the particularities that should be in the regulations. So again, Oxfam and other civil society groups will be involved in reviewing those regulations once they're available and determining whether they're up to the standards that we think they should be up to. In terms of the draft PSC, we have seen, specifically on contract disclosure, an articulation that the PSC is a public document which the government can release. So that would mean that the confidentiality that exists in the current PSC model is done away with. And the idea of this is that because the Constitution calls for this access to information, that PSCs should be tabled in Parliament or reviewed by Parliament and debated. So we welcome these processes. So that's our engagement with the government. We're also engaging with other stakeholders, specifically with civil society, with the private companies, and with the communities. Now, our work with civil society at the moment is really mainly focused on capacity building and organizing. And this agenda setting report goes some way towards achieving those objectives. We're doing that both at the national level, which is Charles's platform is a national level platform, but we're also looking to design a county level platform, which will be composed of civil society groups that are from the areas where there have been oil finds or where there's exploration going on, which we think is a better way of making sure that the needs of the communities in those areas are dealt with. So we haven't started that yet, and it's a sort of continuous process of fundraising and designing the strategy, but that's a key component of what we're doing. But while we're doing that, we're meeting with those groups and asking them to share with us what are their greatest concerns. And a lot of them are centered around information. what is the sector? What does it mean when we see big trucks coming in with great big machines? We're seeing areas cordoned off. We see flights coming in and out. And part of not having information leads to conjecture, it leads to nervousness, and we're trying to see how we can address that information gap and make sure that all stakeholders involved are sharing information either in fora where everybody sits and asks questions directly, or other mechanisms which would make sure that we don't have communities living in those areas thinking that something untoward is happening. As John has mentioned, these are communities that are historically marginalized. So that exacerbates their concerns that somebody is stealing our oil. That's the kind of thing that we're hearing over and over again. So that's with respect to civil society. At the same time, we're engaging with the private sector, and we have representation here from Tullow Oil, which is, as you know, the main player, at least in Kenya at the moment, and in the general consciousness. I think if you ask most Kenyans what oil companies are exploring in Kenya, they would probably just name Tullow. So we know that it's important to engage with the private sector, and whether we act as a conduit of information between the parties or articulate some of the concerns that we're hearing from the community and civil society groups, that's the role that we're looking to play. So in terms of international engagement, we recognize that on issues of transparency and accountability, it's not enough to have only local drive and local advocacy and a local push for disclosure of information. And part of that is because the reality is that a lot of the companies that are operating in Kenya are listed elsewhere or headquartered elsewhere. So we're working very closely with our colleagues in Oxfam in the US who have done a lot of work on global disclosure. And with respect to the work specifically being done in the US, it's to do with the Dodd-Frank law, Section 1504, which stipulates that companies have to disclose their operations in the extractive sector, for example, how much is being paid and all that. And our colleagues in the US are so active on this that they're instrumental in making sure that the SEC has drafted guidelines, the implementing regulations for the Dodd-Frank law. And where we are now is that Oxfam America has sued the SEC in federal court, pushing for those regulations to be finalized and to be implemented. So that's a very useful resource for us because a lot of the companies, again, will be coming from the US and the European Union. In the same vein, we're paying very close attention to the work that's being done in this area with respect to the EU directives on accounting and transparency. And we've been heartened to see the UK leading on this and actually having a law that we believe will be going into effect at the end of this year, with reporting beginning in 2016. So we're very heartened to see that. We're also following the work of the OECD, which is this year supposed to produce guidelines on reporting on the extractive sector, so OECD countries and the G20. So these are some of the international processes that we're following because we think and we see the value of having that sort of national and international processes going on at the same time with respect to transparency. And we've actually seen the fruits of this keeping an eye on the international disclosure, and we have access to one of the PSCs, which is the production sharing contracts, which is between Carmack Energy and the government of Kenya, which gives us a sort of idea of the kinds of provisions that are negotiated by the government. Of course, they're all different because it's individual negotiation, but at least from those processes, we're able to access the contracts in the absence of contract disclosure, which at the moment we don't have yet. But on that, we've had very promising remarks from our president on contract disclosure. He has, on the record, said that absolutely these contracts will be shared and will be open. And we've also had the same kind of commitment from Tullow and other companies which are operating in Kenya. So we're hoping to see this commitment to contract disclosure become actualized, and we're committed to ensuring that process goes on. And part of this is not just to have the contract disclosure just for the sake of it, but it's in recognition more and more and more that in the extractive sector, the absence of information really leads to a lot of nervousness. And that kind of nervousness is what has led to conflicts around the world and what could potentially lead to conflicts in the northern part of Kenya, where a lot of exploration is happening, and at the coast, where again a lot of exploration is happening. So we're keeping an eye on all those processes and really pushing to make sure that we get the right kind of information, and that we then, as civil society groups, convey that information to the communities and to Kenyans in general. Because again, the complexity of the sector means that simply releasing a contract does not quite add value, but that we're able to bring together the people who can analyze the contracts and deconstruct them and explain what the government share of the profits would be, or the revenue would be, and how that would then trickle down to the communities and to the county level, and understanding the volumes of money that would be involved, and taking into consideration the lack of capacity, whether it's absorptive capacity, spending capacity in these areas. So at the same time, using using our networks to make sure that communities and counties are equipped to deal with that sort of huge injection of revenue at the time when that happens. So these are sort of some of the work that we're doing. It's still a very young program, at least in Oxfam, and it's a program that requires a continuous iterative examination of the strategy, and listening to what the communities are saying, listening to other civil society groups, talking to government, talking to the private sector, and refining and redefining constantly to make sure that we have the right mix of activities happening to ensure that in the long term, this is a sector that will be successfully developed in Kenya. So in summary, Oxfam is committed to being in this sector, and is committed to ensuring the sort of prudent development of the oil and gas sector, and to transparency and accountability in the sector.
Thank you very much. So we've heard from John, Charles, and Ndanga, which leaves one more speaker before it's your opportunity to ask lots of questions. And unusually for our meetings at Chatham House, we've provided more time. So we have plenty of time at the moment. We're on time. So do get ready with your questions. Well, I've got here next to me Simon Thompson. We've already heard a lot about Tullow, and he is the chairman of Tullow Oil, having joined the board as a non-executive director in May 2011. Following a career in banking, Simon joined Anglo American in 1999 in South Africa. He became a member of the executive committee in 2003 and executive director in 2005. After he left Anglo American, he has served on the boards of Newmont Mining Corporation and the United Company Rusal. He is also, and I hadn't realized this, he's also currently a non-executive director of Rio Tinto, Sandvik and AMEC. He is also a member of the IFC Advisory Panel on Business and Sustainability. So plenty of private sector experience in the extractors, oil and gas and mining and construction also. So Simon, what are your thoughts? I know you've read the report, so what do you think about the report, and where do you see the road forward?
Well, thank you very much, Alex, and good afternoon, everybody. It is actually a privilege to be invited here to give an industry perspective on the civil society's agenda for Kenya's oil and gas development. As Alex said, I've been advising and working for the natural resources industry long enough to remember the days when meetings like this that brought together civil society and mining and oil and gas companies typically started off in a sort of atmosphere of mistrust and progressed into mutual incomprehension and typically ended with mutual recrimination. So I think it's a measure of just how far industry and civil society has progressed over the last few decades that I can say that I think I agree with the overwhelming majority of the analysis in the report, and I agree with nearly all of the specific recommendations that are put forward in the agenda. I also think it is a remarkably well written, clear document. It really does provide an agenda. And what I like about it particularly is that it's very much focused on actionable, deliverable objectives. As you would expect, I have a few caveats, and I'm going to come back to those in a couple of minutes. when I give an industry perspective. But before doing that, I just want to touch briefly on the role of government. Earlier this year, I gave a speech at an IFC sustainability conference in Washington, where I tried to draw attention to the need to bring government back to centre stage in the debate about sustainable development and the extractives industry. Now, that perhaps wasn't a very diplomatic thing to do, given that the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, was hosting that conference. But I think what this agenda does is really to underline the point that the overwhelming burden here of the to-do list that civil society has drawn up falls on government. It falls on government and Parliament, and particularly the counties, which is a point I'll come back to. And that's not in the least bit surprising, because if a country has no oil, then it has no need for a legal, fiscal, or regulatory framework to manage the oil industry. And as has already been commented, Tullow only discovered oil in Kenya in commercial quantities a year or so ago. So I think it's important to acknowledge just how fast the government of Kenya has already moved, really, in starting to build a framework to manage the industry and to regulate the industry. But I think, as this report makes clear, if Kenya is going to convert its natural resource wealth into sustainable and inclusive economic development, there's still quite a lot more work that needs to be done on the legal, regulatory and institutional framework. And whilst it's clearly desirable that those changes take place relatively rapidly, it's actually much, much more important that they are done well. And I say that because any responsible oil company that has a long-term commitment to investing in the country will tell you that their top priority is they want a legal, fiscal and regulatory framework that is fair, equitable, that is competently administered, but above all, stable and predictable. And in fact, I can't emphasize this point enough. The development of Kenya's oil industry depends upon that, because shareholders and banks will simply not invest the billions of dollars that are required to develop Kenya's oil industry unless they are confident that the rules are not going to change. And in a sense, that the importance of that has only increased with the development of the shale gas and oil industry in the United States. Because in the past, the choice might have been, do we invest in Kurdistan or do we invest in Kenya? Now investors in the oil and gas industry have the option of investing in the United States. So creating a stable framework in which people can invest for the long term with confidence that the rules are not going to change is hugely important for Kenya and indeed for the whole of Africa. So I think, in a sense, government, oil companies, civil society, multilateral and bilateral development agencies, international NGOs active like Oxfam in Kenya, we all have a common interest, I think, in trying to make sure that Kenya really does develop an effective regulatory framework and the capabilities to administer that regulation effectively. And I think one of the points that Ndanga raised and Charles talked about, this isn't just central government. I think the report almost understates the challenge that we face because of the new devolved constitution in Kenya, in really getting clarity around the roles and responsibilities of the counties and trying to make sure that the counties have the capacity to exercise and carry out those responsibilities effectively. So moving on to the companies, the list of the to-do list for the companies, which is set out in this report, it's somewhat shorter than government, but in some respects no less daunting. And it does, of course, start with this question of transparency, which is an area where Tullow has quite deliberately taken a lead. We published all of our payments to governments around the world in 2012. In 2013, we expanded that reporting so that we reported on a project-by-project basis in each country. And that was in line with our understanding at that time of the EU Accounting and Transparency Directive, which of course is due to become law in the UK later this year. So we've been voluntarily ahead of the game on this for the past 2 years. And I think we did that really because we are clear in our own minds that transparency is an absolutely vital first step in building trust. And trust is something which is in short supply in the oil industry in Africa, not just in Kenya, but across Africa. Because in general, the people of Africa do not trust the oil industry. Many politicians do not trust the oil industry. One has to say the people don't tend to trust the politicians either. And in fact, the politicians don't trust the politicians. So you have this atmosphere of mutual distrust. And if you pour billions of dollars into that sort of atmosphere, it is almost inevitable that you will get accusations of corruption and cheating. And what transparency does is that it creates the ability to have a fact-based discussion rather than one based on hearsay. And that is why Tolo took a clear lead on providing the information that people want. Now, Ndanga made the point that civil society has rightly been pressing companies. Oxfam has been absolutely at the forefront of pressing companies for greater transparency on their oil tax payments. But we all need to recognise that transparency by companies is just the first step. If I go and visit our operations in Turkana, people ask me for jobs, people ask me for contracts, occasionally people ask me for money. They do not, in general, say what we really need is more tax disclosure in your annual report. So there's a role here for civil society to translate what will be an absolute wave of data coming once Frank Dodds comes into effect, once the EU directive comes into effect, on tax payments, and to convert that data, that flood of data, into information that is useful and relevant to the citizens of Kenya and around the world. And that does mean that civil society is going to have to increase its level of expertise in the economics of the oil industry, in contract law, and in the interpretation of quite complex financial data. I think there's onus also on business, and certainly Talo is committed to doing this, to make the data accessible in a form that enables it to be more easily consolidated and manipulated into that sort of useful data. The second item on the to-do list for oil companies is a request for them to state their willingness to participate in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Tullow is already a corporate supporter of EITI, and as we've demonstrated in Ghana, we have absolutely no objection to publishing our petroleum agreements. I think, as the report makes absolutely clear, EITI is not a universal panacea, but we believe that it is a good start, because again, it helps to build trust, and it does create a forum where government and business and civil society can get together and try to resolve their differences. The remaining items on the to-do list for companies are more challenging because they relate really to social and environmental performance, and specifically to security, human rights, free, prior, informed consent, land, livelihoods, community engagement. And these are some of Tullow's biggest challenges in Kenya. John talked a little bit about Turkana, the marginalisation of Turkana as a region. It is inhabited by nomadic pastoralists. There's an 82% of the population, at least, have no formal education whatsoever. It is desperately poor. It's suffering from a drought. There's a history of intertribal conflict there. And there are a lot of guns. Now, that's the situation before we discovered oil. Inevitably, oil has created some wildly unrealistic expectations of the speed and impact that it will have in the local community. And that's exacerbated some of the underlying tensions that I described. But also, we must recognise that oil, at least in the short term, has also created some fairly obvious inequality in a community that hitherto has been uniformly poor. Now, in the long term, oil has the potential, if it's well managed, to provide a window of opportunity for those communities to break the cycle of poverty. But in the short term, it is creating some real tensions because of the inequality that it is bringing. So we have to work our way through all of those challenges, and specifically we have to address the questions of water, question of land, question of security, and the question of jobs. because the protests that we have had on site so far have been about jobs and about who gets the jobs. And that brings me back a little bit to my opening remarks on the relationship between business and civil society, because the agenda has a long list of, I think, very relevant demands on government, on parliament, on companies, on donors, and on the media. It's actually silent on the role of civil society. And I think that's a pity. Now, perhaps civil society took it for granted that their role was clear, but I actually think it's worth spelling out what role civil society can play, because the problems we're discussing here are too big and too complex for the private sector and government to solve alone. We really do have to find ways of working more effectively in partnership with civil society organisations, on the ground especially, so that we get a much better understanding of the stakeholder concerns, and so that we address the root causes of grievances rather than just the symptoms. And specifically, I would say that we need civil society's help in translating the language of business into the language that the local communities will understand, and vice versa, just as importantly. We need civil society's help to avoid some of the unrealistic expectations that I was talking about, and we need civil society to challenge our assumptions and to offer an alternative viewpoint. Now, we will not always agree, and clearly one of the prime responsibilities of civil society is to hold business and of course, governments to account if they're doing things wrong. But we need to establish, I think, a framework where civil society operates to the same standards of integrity and honesty and transparency that they rightly demand from business, and also where we're clear that civil society is faithfully representing the interests of the local community rather than perhaps pursuing some other broader agenda. And I think all of that is going to require education on both sides, but with goodwill, I believe that we will succeed. If I may, I would just like to use, I think I've got 2 minutes left to talk very briefly about local content. And Tullow absolutely supports the need to encourage local content. And let's be clear, short supply lines are good for business. And to be honest, the more Kenyans who have a stake in our success, the more welcome we will be, the more secure we will be as a long-term investor in Kenya. So we have a clear interest in promoting local content for business reasons wherever we can. But we have to recognise the capacity constraints that we are facing here. Because oil and gas is a highly capital-intensive business. It's a highly technology-intensive business. It creates relatively few direct jobs. Fortunately, onshore developments such as Kenya do offer more opportunities for local procurement than offshore developments like Ghana, Tullow's operations in Ghana. But we will only be able to procure from local suppliers if they meet our technical standards, our safety standards, our environmental standards, and if they're reliable and cost competitive. And for those reasons, we have to be realistic about the capacity constraints that exist within the Kenyan manufacturing and engineering sector currently. And I do think there's a bigger point here as well, which is that tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade between African countries currently represent one of the biggest constraints on growth across the continent. And we need to recognise that local content restrictions are just another form of protectionism. There is, I think, a real opportunity for East Africa to develop an oil services industry over the coming decades. But that will not happen if Kenya and Mozambique and Tanzania and Uganda all insist on local content, because each individual market is just not likely to be big enough to attract serious investment from multinationals, and the national companies will remain subscale unless they have the capability to export to the region and ultimately to the world. So paradoxically, if Kenya and its neighbouring countries pursue a local content policy that is too restrictive, they will actually increase their resource dependency, because the companies that are restricted to their local market will not survive the depletion of oil within that market. So I would suggest that instead of creating a protected local oil services industry with all of the hazards of elite rent capture and so on, which are identified in the report, Kenya's top priority should be to use the window of opportunity that tax revenues from oil will create to diversify the economy. If you look at Kenya, you cannot help to be impressed by the vibrant, dynamic, ambitious young population that it has. And I think the best possible legacy of oil would be to provide them with the education and the infrastructure that they need to diversify the economy and to build a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you to the other speakers on the panel. All right, again, just a reminder, this is a fully on the record meeting, and I've received a number of questions from Twitter, but if you're still watching us through live stream, you can still ask questions, so please use hashtag CHAfrica if you have any questions. And somebody's really enthusiastic. The hand went up even before I'd finished speaking. So you get the first question. Please do tell us who you are.
Sure, thank you very much. My name is George Bowden, and I run our Uganda oil program at Global Witness. And I just wanted to pick up on one of the points that Simon made in regards to using the data that becomes available through the EU and US legislation. I think it is a real challenge. And I think we'd also welcome very much the steps that Tullow has made, both in terms of publishing that data voluntarily, and also in terms of making very public statements about EITI, and also publishing contracts, which is very welcome. Global Witness published 2 oil contracts very recently, and also an economic modelling tool which allows people to start to understand what kind of revenues are going to be generated from contracts. And I think contract transparency is going to be a really key aspect in starting to understand that data. So my question to the panel really is, what can both civil society but also companies do to ensure that contracts don't contain strict confidentiality requirements and that they are made public so that people can start to understand not only the data that becomes available, but why those revenues are generated in the first place? Thanks.
Thank you very much. One of the questions we got in from Twitter was to the panel, has there actually been any contract disclosure in Kenya beyond model agreements? I wonder if one of you could answer that question. I'm going to take a couple more questions. Well, I'll keep on this side. The gentleman just right at the, right by Dara at the back. Yeah. Yes, you, sir.
Hi, my name is Shemi from Lawyers for African Development. I have a question for Simon and the panel.
Okay.
You've made a very good point in relation to having a stable, competent, and trusted legal system. And that's a legitimate criticism of many developing countries. However, doesn't that same requirement fall to the companies themselves? And if I can give an example in an area where you've already been operating, which is Uganda, you quoted a farm-down policy, which essentially you sold your stake in Tullow, Uganda, to a Chinese and Total, which is a French farm. And you had to essentially be taken to court to pay the capital gains tax liability emanating from that change of the rules in the middle of the game. And why would you come to London to settle the dispute, other tax disputes, when the assets are located in a different country? And one question to the panel is, I'm sure there are very many aspirations for translating the benefits to entire society, but what are the practical realities there that you can ensure that they actually get to the people that rightly deserve them? Thank you.
Okay, and I think the lady just next to you wants to ask a question. So please tell us who you are.
Thanks. My name's Celeste Hicks. I'm a journalist. I'm writing a book about the oil industry in Kenya, Uganda, Chad, Niger, and Ghana. So I'm very interested in the debate. I just had a question. I think probably Ndanga is the best person to answer. I just would like to clarify exactly where the energy bill is in Parliament. You said it was coming up for discussion. What does that mean? Where is it? When might it be published? And also, what's the I don't know if anyone can give me an update on the discussions over the export pipeline from Turkana, if that's going to happen, if there's anybody interested in building that. Thanks.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll ask Ndanga to respond, and then we'll go along. So Simon, then John and Charles, and then we'll get more questions. Ndanga.
So I'll answer the last question first. With respect to where the bill is, it's currently still being drafted, hasn't yet been presented to the Cabinet, and only after that will it go into Parliament, so it's not yet in Parliament. With respect to the pipeline, that's, I think, as far as we know, contracts have been signed. The process of getting financing is going ahead. Feasibility studies haven't happened yet, but parties who will do them have been identified. So the pipeline will be built, at least that's what we're hearing, but it hasn't started yet. Yeah, the process is going along, yeah. Which contract? I think there's several contracts. It's not just one, but no, we don't have access to that yet.
Okay. Simon, there were some questions for you.
Yeah, confidentiality agreements. I mean, in the past, it was just customary for these agreements to have a confidentiality clause which bound both parties, the government and the oil company, to treat the information as confidential unless both agreed. I think that may well change with time as more and more agreements become public, because I think part of the reticence on the part of governments, at least, to go public with these agreements comes back to a point that Ndanga made, that a lot of governments, when they're negotiating agreements, particularly in the frontier regions, don't feel that they necessarily had the capacity to negotiate good agreements when they entered into them. And therefore they are fearful that should the agreements become public and show that they've done a poor deal, that they will be embarrassed by opposition politicians and so on. The information that we have is that actually the governments in East Africa have nothing to be embarrassed about. They've done pretty good agreements. You can benchmark them against other countries around the world, and they stack up pretty well. So I think as progressively more and more governments do enable these agreements to be published, people will be able to benchmark themselves, and they'll realise actually there's nothing here to be embarrassed about. There's every reason to go public. The Ugandan question, we're obviously talking principally about Kenya today, and I really don't want to get involved in the detail. The very short answer to your question was that our disagreement was with Heritage Oil under an agreement governed by English law, and therefore we took them to court in London. So that's why it wasn't in Kampala. And just on the pipeline point, the pipeline is absolutely critical. Both to Kenya and Uganda, because absent a route to export markets, none of the upstream developments will take place. But at this stage, it's very early days. We're still very much at the scoping both the route and doing sort of front-end engineering design. So there is no contract at this stage other than for doing that very preliminary engineering and design work.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, I think I'll try and attempt to answer the question, benefits to society, what are the practical realities? I think for us in Kenya, particularly for the community in Turkana, one of the key aspects is for them to be made aware of these resources and what they can benefit from this resource find. But it's not only that. I think one of the key instruments in the legislation is that the community will get a particular share, the county government will get a particular share, and the national government will get a particular share. So it's, again, just developing the rules on which particular quantity or amount will go to these particular different entities. But not only that, when we talk about how the community will benefit, the question is who is the community, and is the community organized in such a way that they can benefit from that? And it's not only that you getting the money, it's the proper, I think, utilization of that revenue that comes your way. Because I think Charles and Danga were talking about the devolution that we are under at the moment. We're still having problems with what that devolution would look like and what the communities or those counties can do. So I think one of the practical examples to ensure that there is both transparency at the national and at the devolved level, because if there's no transparency in the allocation of that mineral resource and the taxes that go there, I think then we run into the practical problems of corruption and etc. Taking place. And then also, I think the question of expectation of the community is vital. So I think that's the role where civil society has to come in. And we need to then work very closely with the community and then national and local government to ensure that then the externalities that do benefit. So because I think Simon has mentioned that oil does not provide as many jobs, but we then have to link it to other sectors of the economy. And then that then goes to the question of what development model are we adopting as a country, given the historical marginalization of the Turkana and these marginalized regions. What do we have to do practically to ensure that maybe we have a stabilization fund, so part of that resource wealth, should that go into that fund to ensure then there's affirmative action for Turkana?
Charles?
Yeah, I'll start with a Twitter question on contract disclosure, whether there's actually been any disclosure. And the quick answer to that is yes, but it has been through the SEC and the Canadian stock exchanges. Those are the only contracts that are available that we've been able to look at in their entirety, apart from any other situation, and those are publicly available. George's question around contract disclosure and how we'll be able to break down, yes, indeed I feel that this is a CSO role, that the CSO role would be that once these contracts are actually disclosed, that we are able to break it down in terms of revenue and what these revenues mean. And for example, at the moment, the Kenyan legislation talks about a 70% take for government, 25% to the county government, and 5% to the community. So it's important that the civil society starts translating these figures into what this would mean, so that communities can actually now start getting prepared for what kind of developmental projects that they would like to undertake, if indeed that the law gets passed with these provisions still intact. The last question around the practical realities, I guess the challenge is just how do you integrate communities' livelihoods into the oil and gas sector? So Turkana is largely pastoralist. How do you integrate a pastoralist community into oil and gas, whether it be through insisting that companies do purchase locally, for example, meat, and Simon had mentioned it about the standards. So how do you make sure that the community's products reach the standards that the companies are able to access? And this is something that we've been talking about with the Kenya Bureau of Standards, for example, in terms of enabling these communities to actually access this. But the biggest thing will be in terms of the revenues. Once the revenues come, and that's why we are pushing for expenditure transparency, is that once the revenues actually come, what is government spending these revenues on, and especially to ensure that of poverty alleviation.
Okay, let's get some more questions. I'm going to this middle block here. Gentleman there first. We'll take a cluster. You, sir. No, the gentleman with the very clean white shirt. You, sir.
My name is Mr. Mohammed Harun. I'm from an organization called Coastal Management, Marine and Coastal Management. Africa has a experience, I think, with oil sector in a variety of different, from Nigeria's free for all, to Angola's infrastructure for oil. That's, I think, something Kenya can look at, that variety of different systems. But my question is for the Oxfam Naganda. And also, I think Oxfam has done a good job, not only in this sector or in these Kenyan things, but Oxfam has been, I think, on the side of the global south or the Bura, even at the Doha round, Oxfam has been negotiating on behalf of the those who cannot afford high-level lawyers or good international negotiators in Geneva. So I think you can do even higher by looking at how the governments select the companies. By the time contract is signed, it's good thing to know that contract is signed and how it's been transparency and all of that. But we have to know how these companies are first place, how they come into being before they come into the door. there is issues, for example, the Chinese involvement of
Yeah, so, sorry, I'm worrying about the time, but I
Yeah.
think your point is that Oxfam can help on
Yes,
discerning
can go
what are
further.
good and bad companies and give some advice in that respect, yes?
Yeah, that's the.
Okay, if you pass the microphone just to the gentleman next to you, please,
Hello,
sir.
my name's Alistair Beardsall. I'm the chairman of Sterling Energy. Similar to Tullow, we do endorse the EITI. We've been making disclosures for several years. In terms of openness, we would be happy to disclose many confidential agreements. However, one has to bear in mind that if you have a disagreement with the other party, it is better to resolve these disagreements in private rather than have the public baying for blood from one side or the other. In terms of disclosure, along with disclosing the commercial terms of these agreements, it will be the role of the civil society organizations to inform the local population, not just of our terms on that particular agreement, but also to remind people that we may have spent several hundred million drilling dry holes in other countries, and to explain our entire business model and not just our contractual terms in Kenya. In terms of the life cycle of an oil project, we may well be spending exploration dollars for 5 years, we may then be spending development dollars for 7 years, and the next 3 or 4 years we will be recovering those costs. So in terms of expectations to the society, they have to have a clear understanding of the commercial benefits to the company and also the timescales. And my question really to the panel is, how can you effectively get this, my viewpoint, or the viewpoint of the industry, across to the populations, not just of Kenya, but of any of African nations, that creates a fair and balanced view of business? Because we're all in business together.
Thank you. If we can pass the microphone right, yeah, it's just behind you, sir. Yeah, it's just there. Tell us who you are.
Yeah, my name is Julius Baluto. I'm a journalist. My first question is to the chairman of Tolo, Simon. Whenever there is exploration of oil in different countries in Africa, most of the times the communities there do not feel the importance of the oil. They don't benefit either. So my question is just to come up with a quick formula of making sure this Kenyan community benefit. You're talking about less or lower percentage of education. How about these companies, together with the government, building schools to improve those standards? Whenever it comes to low employment opportunities also, how about apprenticeships to these communities, because people can be trained on job and learn new skills and benefit? Lastly, in terms of integrating the communities to the oil and gas era, which is new to them, I reckon perhaps according to Charles, it's not just about looking into their products being consumed, but actually thinking how you can improve their minds and educate them to aspire to be the engineers in these particular companies. I mean, that's all I can say for now.
Thank you. I have one question also that we got in through Twitter. We've heard a lot from Simon, and he was very clear about his view of local content provisions. But one of the people who was watching through live stream wanted to know what the other panelists' views are on mandatory targets for local content in Kenya. So let's start this side. So we'll start with you, Charles, and we'll move along the panel. Charles.
Yeah. I think our report is pretty clear that what we are asking for is mandatory local content requirements, and that's why we've asked for, we speak of a standalone legislation. And that leads very well to your other question around apprenticeship and skills transfer, because unless you develop a strong local content policy, which sort of mandates the process of how the company will integrate the local population into it, you'll have a situation where, you know, EcoBank, for example, estimates that the Kenyan sector requires about $16 billion of investment, right? There's no point of having this $16 billion of investment coming in only to go out, whether it's through use of other companies or foreign experts. So for us, I mean, it's important that local content is developed, and especially for the national oil company. And that's why we have a specific recommendation on the national oil company, ensuring that it's actually funded so that they can build their capacity to go ahead. You talk about building schools. The production sharing contracts actually have some CSR elements. So I don't want to speak on behalf of Talo, but they're already there, and I think they're already doing quite a bit on the ground in terms of that. But you also have to realize that it's a long-term game, education. In terms of Sterling Energy, you talk about sort of understanding the entire business model. And I must say the biggest challenge is where the oil finds are. If you have oil finds in Turkana, like I said, with the high rates of poverty, government has been largely absent. So for a long time, the civil society was actually providing services, basic services like education and health. So the oil company has come in, and all of a sudden, the oil company is a new savior now, that everyone's looking to be employed by the oil company. They're looking to the oil company to provide water, to provide health, and to provide that. I mean, it's a huge challenge that everyone has to come on board. And rightly so, we point out in our report that government has to step in now. You look at the Kenyan situation where majority of our development was along the railway line, and we sort of neglected the upper areas because there was nothing there. And we almost, I mean, we had a government policy that a lot of investments were going where there would be more returns. So in our tea, in our coffee, we've never paid attention to the north. So all of a sudden they have resources now, and you're looking at them like, oh, actually we want those resources. Then, I mean, it's a huge challenge that everyone has to come on board in terms of delivering. Yeah.
That's fine.
Maybe just a quick one also.
Yeah,
Alice's
please.
question. I think it's also incumbent upon us as civil society to work very closely with businesses, and yes, I agree we have to explain the entire business model. But one of the ways I think you could help us is that, for example, when we question our government to give us these contracts, we're not given these contracts, and we can't see them. So if we can't see them, we can't then explain, how much money is going to the community, how much money the government is getting, and we can't then explain what the expenditure is. And then we run into problems later that, the community is expecting this thing, the government is saying this particular issue. So I think maybe a much more structured dialogue between civil society, community, government, and private companies who are investing in these natural resources is very important, because I think if that trust is not there from the beginning, it's very difficult subsequently to, for us to get that involvement with the communities. And you'll find again with the oil finds, there's huge expectations of what these resources are going to do. I mean, communities are expecting, I think, overnight their problems are going to be solved. So if we can't get that trust going, I think we then run more problems going later.
Thank you. Simon.
On the life cycle of the industry, I mean, I think civil society has a very clear role to play here in translating the language of business into a much more accessible language that people can understand. And I'm looking at basically here, we are still working, I think, with DFID on trying to produce a very simple document that explains the life cycle of oil investment. And I know we've got, there's some civil society organisations that are helping us to do that. But as soon as we have done that, we will make that document as widely available as we possibly can to get that out into the community so that people get a sense of what they can realistically expect from the industry. On the point about schools and education, Talo cannot become another government in Turkana. We're not democratically elected, we're not accountable, it's just wrong. That's the first reason we can't do it. The second reason is we're really, really bad at running schools. I mean, I hope we're quite good at finding oil and producing it, but we are bad at running schools. What we can do, though, is work in partnership. This is a classic area where I think government and business and civil society organisations in the educational field can work much more effectively together. We can we can define the sort of skills that we're looking for. We can help with curriculum design. We can help with providing technical assistance. We can help with internships. We can be much more creative, I think, about how we address some of these issues. And we are already doing that. I think at the moment of our employees in Kenya, something like 58% are from Turkana, notwithstanding the very, very low levels of literacy and formal education that they've required. We are working with them, we are training them, and we are providing them with jobs, and they will progressively move up from unskilled to semi-skilled to skilled, and we hope to managerial. It will take time to do that, but we will do it. And we also, I have to say, provide a huge number of scholarships for people to study both within Africa and in universities in the UK and Ireland and France to acquire the skills that will be needed to build the oil industry over the long term.
Okay. Ndanga, we kind of had the question of which oil company is the favourite of Oxfam?
Yeah.
So,
Well, what Oxfam will certainly not do is to be vetting companies. We don't think that's our role. What our role is in that process, the licensing process, is to make sure that the government has clear, transparent rules on what kind of characteristics, whether technical, reputation, ethical behavior in other places, that it uses to do those selections, and then we hold them to account to making that selection. So that I hope that answers your question. But we don't want to be involved in sort of rankings. That's not the value added. With respect to understanding the life cycle, this is from the gentleman from Sterling, that's precisely what we're doing. And I think I mentioned it when I spoke earlier, is that we want to make sure that civil society has the capacity to translate the sector for the communities. And part of that process is working with companies like Tallow and like yourselves to make sure that we have that knowledge and that we can then put it in a digestible format for the communities. On local content, just quickly, as Charles has said, we've requested in the report that we have a clear standalone policy on local content. And at the moment, you'll find local content provisions in several places. It exists in the PSCs, it exists in the energy policy draft. The local content policy is articulated there. And it also exists in the draft petroleum bill. So we think that this should be kind of neat and then put into one bill. But over and above that, I think we also recognize that local content provisions are an intervention in the market. So they shouldn't be done lightly or carelessly or without thought of the particular context in which they're going to be applied. So what we'd like to see is the Kenyan government really thinking carefully about the kind of local content policy that's appropriate for the oil and gas sector in Kenya in particular, not something sort of picked from somewhere else. And that's what we're pushing for. So I think if we sort of think carefully about that, really carefully addressing what kind of transferable skills we have, what potential we have for further training, what kind of time frames, because I think you have to have a policy that's, and laws that are not just implemented immediately, but that are thinking about the sector, not just the next 2 years, but beyond the development stage, beyond the beginning of production, and that would serve Kenya for short, medium, and long term.
Thank you, Ndanga. So I will take a few questions here. The lady right over there in the corner. We'll take a couple more questions and then we've run out of time.
Hi, my name is Priscilla.
Yeah.
From University of Bradford. Actually Kenyan myself, and I'm interested in listening. I've read the reports and also listened to the panelists, and I'm actually addressing all of them. Effective governance, when you talk about effective governance, for me, it's a very interlinked process. And listening to Oxfam, listening to John and my friend, the other hand.
Charles.
Yes, Charles. There is, I think, I find a missing link, which is so much, we are so heavily on the national, international, and yes, the county or local level is actually mentioned in passing in terms of the governance mechanisms and such. And for me, we cannot think of two without the three. They have to go in tandem. I know it's a starting point, obviously. We have to get it right at the national level, but we also have to get it at the county level, at the local, in terms of governance mechanisms in place. That brings me to the bit of, well, my interest is on the conflict prevention aspect of it. We don't have to wait to go the Nigeria way and such kind of thing. What do we need to put in place as of now? We've talked, John opened very well on the context. But then this context, for me, we also have to put it, there are two realities of this context. There's a national context and there's also a context at local level. This is Turkana. And this context is something that needs to inform all of us, including even the investor, Tallow Oil, in terms of the expectations where it's coming from. And therefore, we'll expect that to inform also the conflict-sensitive approaches in terms of extractive industry and how you approach probably Turkana may not necessarily be the same way we approach things at the national level. Those are two different contexts.
Okay, and there was one more question here. Yep, you, sir.
Thank you. Hi, my name is James Royston from Publish What You Pay. I just wanted to go back to the point that Ndanga made about the mandatory disclosures laws that are coming in around the world, notably the Accounting and Transparency Directives in the EU, which Publish What You Pay campaigned very strongly for, also the 1504 Dodd-Frank laws in the US, which we hope, thanks to Oxfam's actions, will be coming into force soon. And obviously we welcome Tullow Oil's decision to publish the payments they already make on a project-by-project basis ahead of the time when they're required to. But I just wanted to ask, can any of the panelists give any information on, any indication of information you'd expect to get from the data we will receive in relation to these laws? Are there projects that you don't know much about at the moment where you expect to find out more? Are there particular issues that you feel will be resolved as a result of that? And how important is it to be able to identify the company, the individual project, and the level of government associated with payments? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We're on borrowed time. I'm going to take one question just here, because this is a larger cluster of people.
Thank you very much. I'm Sol Pichotta from Lancaster University
Okay.
and the International Centre for Tax and Development. Obviously, the issues that have been discussed are important, but it seems to me the rather large issue that hasn't been tackled is how confident are you that the tax framework is good enough to ensure that Kenya does get a fair share of revenue? The main benefit really from extraction has to be revenue. How you spend it is important, but are you confident that the revenues can be effectively gathered? The report has a rather short section, which is a bit alarming, talking about tax havens and so on. There's nothing substantive about the tax framework.
Okay, thank you very much. Through live streaming, we did have a couple of other questions. One was just how can an individual get access to the agreements that Tullow has signed to date? I mean, where does Tullow actually publish what it's been doing in Kenya? That was one question. And the second one was, do any of the panel see any benefits or positive effects of the recent public finance management system reforms in Kenya on the management of oil revenues? So I guess I'll start with Ndanga. Please, we've got very little time now, so short answers.
Okay.
Ndanga.
Okay, I'll take the first one from Priscilla on the question of effective government at the county level. We are actively engaging at the county level. Like I mentioned, it's a two-pronged approach. We're doing the national level engagement with civil society groups, which Charles's platform is a part of. But we're also engaging at the county level. And just last week, I was in both Turkana and Wajir talking to local groups about the kinds of issues and concerns that they have. And that's to feed into a strategy that will hopefully allow us to get funding that will allow those groups to be working in those communities, engaging on these issues. We also have a member of the platform, which is the Danish demining group, which has just done a conflict analysis in 5 counties, which are exploration areas. So we're hoping that that study will also inform our strategy in those areas. So we are concerned, and yes, we are actively engaging on it.
Thank you. Simon.
Absolutely agree on the point that was made about the counties being critical here and an awful lot of work to be done there in terms of capacity building. On the revenue point, I think revenue collection is something which hasn't been particularly mentioned, but it clearly also is an area where there is an urgent need for government to build capacity to ensure that it has a really effective audit function to avoid transfer pricing and so on. And on the agreements, our agreements with the government of Kenya are still subject to a confidentiality agreement with the government. The president, as Ndanga mentioned, has indicated that he intends to change that. So far as our agreements with the government of Ghana are concerned, you can see them on our website.
Okay, thank you. John.
Sorry, I didn't get your name, but I think the question you were raising, I think I touched on it briefly on tax havens, because we're working with one of our partners, the Tax Justice Campaign for Africa, to ensure that there's more transparency for multinational corporations who use tax havens, whether in Europe, in America, to hide some of their profits. So one of the things about this campaign is that we're trying to then work closely with the government of Kenya to ensure that for the country to benefit, they must look at where these companies are registered, and if they're registered in these tax havens, they must find a way of then dealing with those disclosures, because again, if you're not able to then get this information through those tax havens, it becomes problematic. Recently, we then engaged the government because they signed a double taxation agreement with Mauritius, which happens then to be a secret jurisdiction. So we're then challenging the government. On the one hand, you're talking about revenue, getting revenue from companies and ensuring that then development takes place, but then you're then signing a double taxation agreement with Mauritius that then negates that. So actually, we're then trying to engage them in that. But it's a difficult process, because on the one hand, the government says they understand, but on the other hand, they then go and do things that are around counter to that. So I think it's, again, for civil society to continue to engage systematically with government and, again, companies to ensure that, the use of tax havens is reduced.
Okay, and finally, Charles, and please do, because for those who've been live streamed, we have plenty of hard copies of the report at the door, but just tell people where they can get this report from which website also. Thank you.
I'll just my colleagues deal with most of the question. The last question from Twitter was on the public financial management system and how that has impacted, and whether this has impacted on the new revenues once they come on stream. Our proposal in our report is that actually these revenues are treated separately, so they just do not go straight into the budget, because we feel that if they just go straight into the budget, then they will go into the same sort of wasteful expenditure that we are seeing now, and that's why we proposed a budget fund, a stabilization fund, as well as a future revenues fund. And lastly, the report is available on our website, which is www.kcspog.org.
Well, thank you to the audience for all the questions, and thank you to the panelists, and have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.